Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my April wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of April. So I managed to get quite a lot read in April. In the end, I read 14 and a half books, which is a decent amount. I said at the beginning of the month that I was going to try and focus on historical fiction in the month of April, which I sort of did. I also read 3 classics and 1 non-fiction book and 1 poetry book, but the rest of what I read was predominantly historical fiction. I got through 7 and a half of the books that were on my historical fiction TBR, and then I also read 2 other books which I kind of thought were literary fiction but ended up having some historical elements too. So still a pretty historical month. But I will start off as usual with the classics, as I read 3 classics this month. The first book, the oldest book I read this month, was The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. I read this mostly because I was feeling that my reading was somewhat lacking the Victorians, and so I just went to the shortest Victorian book that I had on my Kindle, which happened to be The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. I quite like H.G. Wells, and I did enjoy this. As the title suggests, it is about an invisible man, a scientist who manages to turn himself invisible and gets a little bit intense with the power that gives him. I enjoy H.G. Wells. I find his writing quite interesting, and I find his science fiction quite interesting in terms of the themes it explores, but I do have to say that in terms of like actual enjoyment, none of the 4 of his science fiction books that I've read are like anywhere near as good as his non-science fiction book Kips, which I love. So I think the next H.G. Wells I read will be another non-science fiction one, as I think I just enjoy the realist fiction that H.G. Wells writes a little bit more. The next classic I read was a World War I book. This is Her Private's We by Frederick Manning. This was published in the 20s, shortly after the First World War, and it is a novel, but it was written by a man who did fight in the First World War, and a lot of the events are kind of taken from his actual experiences. One of the novels I'm currently working on doesn't take place in World War I, but World War I is quite important in it, if that makes sense. So someone from my writing group kindly lent me this as they thought I would find it interesting for historical research, and I found it interesting for historical research, but I didn't love it as like a novel, if you see what I mean. It was really interesting in terms of the exploration of World War I, and it's about a man who is a private and is kind of being pressured by his superiors to become an officer. Like I said, I found it very, very interesting on a historical level, and it was good sort of research for my novel, but I found the writing a little bit dry, and so in that sense I found it a bit hard to get through. So yeah, a mixed one for me, I guess. The next classic I read was A Buyer's Market by Anthony Powell. This is for the read-along of Anthony Powell's series, A Dance to the Music of Time, that I'm currently hosting, so I have made an individual book review on this, which I'll link down below, and I'll also link down below the Goodreads group if you'd like to join in with the read-along for the series. This series is my favourite series of all time and some of my favourite books of all time, and it follows the life of a man called Nick Jenkins and kind of everyone he meets along the way. And in this book, he's sort of in his early 20s, just finished university, trying to find his way in life in the late 1920s, and it's marvellous, and I love it, and it's funny, and it's brilliant, and it's, yeah. I've done a whole video on this, so I don't need to talk about this too much here. On to the historical fiction. One thing I read this month was The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey. This is a proof copy, so the final one looks slightly different, and Vintage very kindly sent me a proof copy to review. I was really excited to get to this because Samantha Harvey was actually one of the tutors on my creative writing masters, and I've read 2 of her books before, both of which I really loved, and I really love this a lot as well. It is set in 15th century England, and it is about a village priest, and it starts off with the priest being told that a body has been found. And that was how I knew it began. But what I didn't know about this book, which is utterly awesome about it, is that it works backwards. So it's structured like day 4, day 3, day 2, day 1, so that you see the day on which the body is found, and then you kind of go back to find everything that's happened in between, which is so wonderful. John Reeve, our narrator, is a really, really interesting character, and quite an unreliable narrator in many ways, which I found really, really interesting, because you get a sense as you go through the book of things that he might know that he hasn't been telling you over the course of these days. Things which you didn't quite understand which happened in day 4, which suddenly make much more sense when you get to day 2 or day 1. And also because he is a priest, the book looks really, really interestingly at issues of religion, and moreover I think issues of morality. I found it really, really powerful and moving, and the themes are so complex and the structure just wonderful. Like, I love books that do interesting things with structure, so yes, I would definitely recommend this one and the rest of Samantha Harvey's books. I've got 1 more book by her to read, which I think is All Is Song, and after that I think I'll probably do an individual author spotlight video on her because I really enjoy her books. So yes, you have that to look forward to at some point in the future. Another book I read in April was The Last Runaway by Tracy Chevalier. This is set in 1850s America. It is about a young woman from a Quaker family in Dorset who moves across the world to America, and it follows her life in America and what happens to her there, specifically focused on the ways in which she gets involved with helping runaway slaves from further south than where she is in America travel through the country. So she becomes part of the Underground Railroad, and it's about sort of clash between her wanting to help people and the danger that puts her family in, effectively. There are a lot of things about this I really, really liked. It's an interesting period in history, and I thought it was really well written, really engaging, as Tracy Chevalier's books always are. I didn't find it quite as impactful as A Girl with a Pearl Earring. It just didn't quite, like, blow me away in the same way, so I really enjoyed it, but it was kind of like, you know, 4-star rather than 5-star read for me. But I'm definitely looking forward to reading more by Tracy Chevalier in the future. I've got At the Edge of the Orchard, I think it's called, on my shelves as well, so I'll probably get to that at some point in the next few months too. So yeah, she's still an author I really like, though I didn't find this one quite as immediate and engaging as The Girl with the Pearl Earring. I think it's partly because this is in third person and The Girl with the Pearl Earring was in first person, and I slightly preferred her first person writing style, maybe? I'm not sure. But yeah, anyway. Another book set in mid-19th century America. This is Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, and this was definitely one of my favourite books of the month. I'm sure will end up being one of my favourite books of the year. It was really, really, really brilliant. And I know it's not for everyone. Like, reading it, I can tell that it wouldn't be for everyone, but it was very, very, very much for me. And it follows two men, our narrator Thomas and his romantic partner John, and it explores their relationship as a gay couple in the 19th century America, and also their kind of family relationship with this little Native American girl that they adopt, and it also follows their lives fighting in both the Indian Wars and later in the American Civil War. There are a lot of things I loved about this. One thing that I adored about it is the narrative style. The narrative voice is really, really distinct. It feels like someone is talking to you in a bar kind of vibe. And it is very unique, and I can see that it wouldn't be for everyone, but for me it really, really worked. I really, really enjoyed it because I like interesting narrative voices, and I found it surprisingly easy to read for what is a very kind of strong voice with slightly odd wording at times, and I found it intensely moving and really, really beautiful. I think the way Sebastian Barry explores issues of kind of family and love and sort of sexuality and gender as well are really, really important. Both Thomas and John, when they're teenagers, spend time in a bar where they are paid to dress as women in order to sort of entertain the men there, and Thomas in later life goes on to perform on stage as a woman and talks about these kind of conflicting identities of feeling really, really comfortable in women's clothing and sometimes feeling more like a woman than a man, but also being a soldier, and that sort of more macho masculine identity and sort of how they conflict. And also I think the love story in here between John and Thomas is done really, really well. There are a few moments where the narrator Thomas kind of expresses in just a few sentences how difficult it is to be in love with someone and not be able to show that to the world, and I think that is done so powerfully, and like the way they build a family with this little girl is just, oh, it's beautiful. It was so good. It was so moving and lovely, and yeah, I loved it. I loved it very, very much. We're on a roll now with the very good books, because I have two more brilliant, like favourite books of the year so far, books to talk about. And the next one is The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley, which is my favourite book of the year so far. Not just one of, but my favourite book of the year so far. I think this will be my favourite book of the year. So a month or two ago, because I'd reached 5,000 subscribers, I did like a favourites week thing, and I did a video on like my top 5 favourite novels. I think this would knock out, I think this would knock out what's currently at number 5. It might even go higher up than that. Like, that's how good this book was. I read this book and like, I haven't read a book that made me immediately fall in love with it in this way for a long, long time. Like, I don't think I've read a contemporary book since The 13th Tale that I have loved this much. Like, I think it's like up there with The 13th Tale as like one of my favourite modern books of all time. It was so good. It's so up my street. I loved it so much I think I might make an individual review on it. Or, because I have just bought Natasha Pulley's second newer book, The Bedlam Stacks. I bought that like last week because I love this so much. I knew I wanted to read it really soon, and I'm hoping to read that in the next couple of weeks. So what I might do is wait until I've read that and then do a video reviewing both of them together. There are a lot of reasons why I love this. To start off with, I think it's just a really, really engaging, brilliant book with really strong characters and themes and a nice sort of balance of plot and thematic issues. I think there are a few specific reasons why I love it, specifically as well as it just being like a really good book. It's set in the Victorian period, which obviously I love, but also half the characters are Japanese, and another thing I really love apart from Victorian literature is Japanese literature, and sort of Japanese culture is something I'm quite interested in, and Japanese history, so learning about sort of Japanese sub-communities within Victorian London was wonderful. It also has like a clockmaker, obviously, and in a kind of nerdy way I'm quite into like clockwork. If you don't know, for a job I work in publishing and what I edit is antiques guides, and in the last few months, like editing the clock section, I've like learned a lot more about clocks, so I find clockwork really interesting. But aside from like really cool pocket watches, there's also a clockwork octopus. So good though. There's also a little bit of magic, but not too much, just like the right level of magic. Like I found with The Miniaturist, the magical elements never like distracted from the historical elements, it just like added extra poignancy to the plot that was there. I feel like I should actually explain what this book is about now, aside from just raving about how much I love it. It's set in Victorian London. It's about a man called Thaniel. He works as a clerk in the civil service, and one day he comes home and there's a pocket watch on his bed and he doesn't know where it came from. And through various exciting dramatic events, he ends up finding the man who made the watch. Peter Mori, the clockmaker, is just a wonderful character, and I thought he was so superbly drawn. And similarly, along with the kind of Nathaniel plotline, there is a young woman in Oxford called Grace. She really wants to be a scientist, but her parents really want her to marry, and she was a great character as well, especially because I found her quite dislikable, but I also kind of wanted to read about her, which I think is so powerful. I have too much to talk about this book to confine to my wrap-up, so like I said, there will be an individual review on this, or like a dual review with her other book coming sometime soon. But I love this a lot. Like, I cannot recommend this enough. This is utterly my kind of book. I don't know how to describe it better than this. Like, this is just utterly what I like in a novel. Another incredible book I read this month, which I also loved a lot, was Sarah Waters' Tipping the Velvet. Oh, this was so good too. Not quite as good as The Watchmaker of Finsbury Street, but like up there as a superb book. I'd read Fingersmith last year, which I really enjoyed, but I think I did enjoy this quite a bit more, partly because Fingersmith has a lot, dare I say, too many plot twists, whereas this is not quite the same in its plotting. This is about a young woman called Nancy. She lives in Whitstable and she works as an oyster girl. She sort of sells oysters with her family. But Nance becomes infatuated with this music hall singer, Kitty Butler, who through this infatuation, it leads Nancy into like so many different things and different passages of life. It's really interesting because Fingersmith and Tipping the Velvet feel very Dickensian to me, but in quite different ways. I think Fingersmith feels more Dickensian in sort of comparison to books like Bleak House and Our Mutual Friends that have a lot of kind of sudden revelations and a lot of characters. Whereas Tipping the Velvet feels much more akin to like Nicholas Nickleby or The Old Curiosity Shop, which are all kind of episodical, in which the characters sort of travel between different groups of characters and different situations and kind of grow up on the way, I suppose. Like, really, I think Tipping the Velvet is at its heart a coming-of-age story. It follows Nancy from the age of sort of 18 to 25. It just explores how much she grows, and I loved it. Like, I found the ending really moving. I like cried slightly at the end. It's really, really powerful, and I loved it so much. One thing I really loved about it too is how Sarah Waters kind of looks at the kind of underground LGBTQ+ groups within Victorian society, but not just that, but how she looks at how they work differently in different classes. So we visit kind of like upper class groups of queer women, and then kind of very, very different like lower class subcultures. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So yeah, definitely looking forward to reading more Sarah Waters in the future. I love this a lot. So from 3 books I adored onto a book I did really not, I also read Adam Thorpe's 1921 this month, which was a real disappointment to me. I'd read Adam Thorpe's Ulverton before, which I really, really enjoyed. Ulverton is quite a weird novel. It is almost a collection of short stories, and it follows this town through sort of hundreds of years of history, picking up the town in different places from different people's perspectives and utilising like so many different forms and structures. And it was really exciting, and 1921 is not exciting at all. It is one of the most boring books I've read for quite a long time. It's 400 pages of very little happening. And the structure is very kind of conventional, which was a shame because I think having read Ulverton I was kind of looking for something with a more experimental structure. But 1921 follows this young man who has just missed fighting in the First World War. He kind of didn't sign up at the beginning, only sort of went in when conscription was introduced, and then kind of got gassed on training, so never ended up fighting. And now in 1921 he feels that he's kind of missed out on something, and he's trying to write this sort of great novel of the First World War, except it's not really about that. It's really mostly about his like trying to have sex with 2 different women. My main takeaway from it was that it was not very exciting, it was quite boring, and the main character was very, very dislikable. Like, there were nothing really that I liked about him, and he was very kind of arrogant and thought that like all women must adore him, even though there was like nothing appealing about him whatsoever. So I found that quite frustrating. I think there were aspects of this book that could have been quite interesting, but they were all just kind of really underdeveloped. It wasn't really about his writing, it wasn't really about him feeling sort of inadequate because he hadn't fought in the First World War. It was more just about his like failed relationships with these 2 women who he didn't really seem to like and mostly viewed as sexual objects. So I was not a fan of that, and I don't think I'll be reading much more Adam Thorpe after that. I also read Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi. This was a weird one. I feel like I kind of loved it in spite of itself. Basically, it is about this man in the 1930s America, and he is kind of a slightly misogynistic writer. In most of his stories, the women sort of all have sort of terrible, violent endings. So it's about this man, Mr. Fox, and his relationship with his wife, and also with this young woman who's called Miss Fox, but with an E rather than without an E, like his name. And it kind of deals with him sort of coming to terms with the kind of person, the kind of man, the kind of writer he has been, and sort of wanting to become a better person. But that's the novel of it. But it's also kind of a collection of short stories because, as well as getting this kind of central thread of Mr. Fox, we also have a lot of stories supposedly written by Mr. Fox in which different versions of Mr. Fox and Miss Fox and sometimes Mrs. Fox turn up in the stories. I kind of really liked it, but I will say that some of the short stories felt quite shoehorned in. There are some of them where you can definitely see that the characters are Mr. Fox and Miss Fox in different guises, and quite a few where you can't see that at all, and I don't feel like they actually belong here. So I don't think it's a perfect book at all, but I really enjoyed the writing. And it was one of those books where it's quite confusing in structure, it's weird, you're not entirely sure what's going on, but Heather Nayemi's writing is so kind of clear and precise that I didn't really mind. So yeah, I think I'd be curious to read something else by her in the future. This was an odd one, but I kind of enjoyed it quite a bit. Then I also read A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is Ishiguro's debut novel, and I really like Ishiguro. He's one of my favourite authors, so I was quite excited to read this one, and I did really enjoy it. It's not my favourite of his books by any means, but I thought it was a really good one and a really interesting one. So this is one of the ones I said was like kind of historical because it's mostly set in like the 1950s, but it was written in the 1980s, and it's sort of flashback and the present is set in the 1980s, which obviously is like historical to me, but wasn't for this book when it was written and published. So, you know, historical-ish, maybe, but I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really interesting. About a woman called Etsuko. She grew up in Japan but moved to England as an adult, and she currently in England is reflecting on the recent suicide of her daughter and looking back on what happened one summer while she still lived in Japan, and about her friendship with a particular woman. And like all of Ishiguro's narrators, she is a bit unreliable, and we kind of learn a bit more about her as the book goes on. I really, really enjoyed it. I feel like the ending has something a little bit wanting. Like, I kind of got it, but I feel like I needed a few more things to push me to properly get it, if you see what I mean. Like, I don't know. It's one of those books where I finished and then I went and like googled what other people had thought of the ending to check I'd interpreted it right, if you see what I mean. But despite that, I loved his writing, as I always do, and I thought the sort of depiction of 1950s Japan was really, really interesting, especially in terms of the clash between sort of traditional Japanese culture and sort of Western culture, which is something I found really interesting in Japanese fiction in translation before as well. So I really enjoyed this, and I would highly recommend it, as I would with all of his books. I've only got 2 Ishiguro books left now, so hopefully I'll get to them soon, and then I will have read everything by him, and then you can expect a video on his books. Another book I read this month was The High Mountains of Portugal by Jan Martel. This was another letdown for me, quite a big letdown actually. Jan Martel is the author of Life of Pi, which I loved a lot, so I thought this would be interesting, and this is Nick's copy, because he'd read it previously, and he thought that I might like it more than him because it was too literary for him, but it was not the literary I like. So this weird book is split into 3 sections, sort of 3 stories. One takes place in the very early 20th century, sort of in the 1900s, and then the other takes place sort of in the middle of the 20th century, the next a bit later on, I think, so they're kind of historical. I have quite a lot of problems with this book. I didn't enjoy it at all, I think was the main thing. Like, I didn't enjoy any of the stories. They're all quite weird. There are some sort of supernatural aspects in them, but I don't think the supernatural aspects worked. You know, when a story or a book feels like it's being weird only to be weird? Like, just to shock you and for nothing else? Like, that was what I felt with quite a lot of this book. It felt a little bit gimmicky, I suppose, in that way. And also the 3 stories have sort of very subtle links between them that I didn't feel worked. I think the second story was the weakest one for me, which I really, really didn't enjoy reading. And the other 2 I didn't especially like either. I don't really have much more to say about this book. I wouldn't recommend it. It just absolutely wasn't for me. We are getting nearer to the end. That is actually all the novels I finished this month. But I did finish one non-fiction book. That was a history book that I listened to on audiobook, and that was The Storm Before the Storm by Mike Douglas. So Mike Douglas runs a podcast on the history of Rome, which my boyfriend Nick has listened to before, and so me and Nick both got the audiobook and listened to it this month, and both of us were a bit disappointed. I haven't listened to the podcast, which Nick enjoyed much more, but I found this as a history book very inaccessible. It is about Roman history, and specifically it's about sort of the period before the fall of the Roman Republic, not about the like immediate during the fall of the Roman Republic, but like the bit before that, so hence The Storm Before the Storm, and the idea being that it's covering a period in history that is looked at a bit less than sort of the actual rise of Julius Caesar and the fall of the Roman Republic. So I was looking forward to it on that sense, especially since I have recently read Robert Harris's Cicero trilogy, which is a historical fiction series which looks at the rise of Julius Caesar, which Nick and I have actually filmed a whole video reviewing, so that'll be up next week? No, this week. That'll be up on Thursday. Anyway, that's beside the point. So I was really looking forward to reading The Storm Before the Storm and learning a bit more about this kind of historical context of the time, but my main problem with this, I think, was that it's just a really, really inaccessible history. It's just really, really hard to follow. It's very, very narrative heavy, fact driven, very, very little analysis, just kind of this happened, this happened, this happened, with so many Latin names, many of which are the same. So I just found it very, very hard to follow. It was still kind of vaguely interesting. I feel like I probably learned a few things, but not very much. If you know of any other Roman history books, I would be quite interested to know. I really enjoyed SPQR by Mary Beard, and I've been looking for things a bit like that deal with some of the social history, as well as the kind of broader political history, and things that are a bit more accessible for someone who knows a bit but not masses about Roman history. And I also read Inside the Wave by Helen Dunmore. This is Helen Dunmore's poetry collection, which was published shortly before she passed away, and sort of won one of the Costa Prizes. I picked this up at my parents' house. My mum had it and asked if I would be interested in it, and because it's very, very short poetry collection, I just sort of read it while I was at my parents' house one evening. And there were a lot of things I did find really, really powerful about it. There was kind of a mix. There were quite a few poems sort of about landscape and so on, which went a little bit over my head, but the poems about kind of having cancer and battling with approaching death I found incredibly moving. For many reasons, but they were very, very powerful, I think. It was a poem, I think it was called Tree Outside Ward 68, which I thought was, for me, like the most powerful in the collection. I thought was really, really good. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I must actually try and read some of Helen Dunmore's fiction, because I know she wrote a lot of very good historical fiction. In fact, I know my mum has a lot of historical fiction by Helen Dunmore on her shelves, so at some point I'm sure I will be raiding my mum's shelves in order to pick up some historical fiction by her. That's all of the books that I finished in the month of April, but I did say at the beginning of the video that I had read 14 and a half books this month, and I will mention the half that I'm halfway through, because it is The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. So I'm now like maybe 2/3 of the way through, but at the end of April I was halfway through. So I'm not enjoying it very much. This is unexpected. This was on my 5-star TBR prediction video that I made like last year as a book that I was expecting to really, really love. It won't be a 5-star read for me. I am going to finish it. I have thought about DNFing it, but I'm not. I feel like I am going to persevere with it. But it's been like oscillating between like a 2 and a 4-star book for me, and I think it will ultimately be a 2 or a 3-star book. I have so many issues with it. I'll talk about this much more in my May wrap up, I think, because I feel like I need to explain my thoughts in detail because so many people love it and I've been told that I would love it a lot. One thing is that I'm not especially loving the writing, especially there was one thing that was really like heavy in the early chapters that's kind of faded a bit now by later on in the book, which is that Michelle Faber kind of addresses the reader directly and says like, you do this, you follow me here. The problem is that that's something that kind of has a precedent in Victorian literature. Lots of Victorian novelists address the reader, and so it feels like he's trying to emulate Victorian literature because he's writing a historical fiction novel set in the Victorian period, but it's done so differently to the Victorian novels. And I think it's on purpose, but it kind of feels to me, as someone who reads a lot of Victorian literature, like he's just doing it wrong. So there's that, but that's kind of faded. My main problem with it is that I'm just not really engaged in it at all, and I'm finding it a little bit boring. I've heard this book spoken about as being about a prostitute called Sugar who wants to be a writer, and it is about Sugar, but it's actually more, I would say, about a man called William Rankin who becomes obsessed with Sugar. And for the first third of the book, you don't get to see from Sugar's perspective very much, and it's mostly just William. And William is not only quite dislikable, but also incredibly boring. Like, there's nothing for me that's interesting about that character. So I found that quite frustrating. Then in kind of the next third of the book, I was enjoying it a bit more, finding Sugar as a character really interesting when we do get to see inside her head, which is more prevalent in sort of the middle section of the book. And also I'm finding sort of Sugar's fascination with William's wife is really, really interesting. And there was a subplot as well with William's brother that I was also really, really enjoying, and that was like my favourite bit of the book. So I was enjoying it more as we got to like the 2/3 mark, and then Michelle Faber has just like shut down one of the things that I was enjoying about the book, which makes me think that I'm not going to enjoy the rest of it very much. Also, quite a few people said when this was in my TBR that they enjoyed the majority of the book but found the ending a little bit too on the male wish fulfillment side. And for me, the whole book feels a little bit like that. It's hard because William is a very, very sleazy character, and so because you see things from his perspective a lot, it feels very sleazy, but at the same time he is criticised, and when you see things from Sugar's perspective, you see how William sort of misunderstands things, but at the same time you see a lot from his perspective, and so the book feels really sleazy. I don't really know how else to describe it. I'm gonna see, obviously, I can't like judge it yet till I finished it, but I have a feeling this is not going to be a book that I will ultimately enjoy. But you know, I was enjoying the middle more, and I have sort of 300 pages to go, so I will press on through and finish it. and I'll let you know in May how much I disliked it or whether it was medium in the end. There we have it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of April, so quite a productive month, I would say, overall. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, and if you have similar or different opinions. I'm always really curious to know. If you agree with me about The Crimson Petal and the White, do let me know. I know Gemma from Whiskey and Woodhouse said on Instagram that she didn't much like it either, which did make me feel comforted. So there we go. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.